Hi everyone, this is the Blockchain Socialists, and this is the first episode in a new series that I'm starting that I've called Overthrowing the Network State, in which, in collaboration with a group called Blockchaingov, we'll be tackling Balaji Srinivasan's new book called The Network State. And what we're going to be doing is providing an intellectually honest criticism of the book, while also trying to elucidate what are the things about it that are attracting so many people in the crypto world, and sort of provide some alternatives to it, because we have quite a lot of criticisms about the idea, but we acknowledge that there are a lot of things that are interesting about the idea from a conceptual point of view. But so for this series, it's going to be lasting probably the next couple of months, in which we're going to be releasing episodes once a week. Each episode is going to have one other person co-hosting an interview or discussion with me. That other person will be from Blockchaingov. And for today's episode, I have with me Primavera De Filippi, who you may remember from a previous episode or interview where we talked about her work on executional theory. But maybe before I go on any farther, Primavera, if you want, for those who maybe haven't listened to that episode or may have forgotten, would you want to explain who you are and what Blockchaingov is?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm a researcher at the CNRS in Paris, as well as a faculty associate at the Berkman Center at Harvard. And I'm a legal scholar, and it's been now actually 10 years where my research is pretty much all and exclusively focused on blockchain technology, and in particular looking at the legal and regulatory challenges, but also all the new opportunities that it brings in terms of governance and governance innovation. And so as part of my research, I have initiated in 2001 a new research project that is funded by the European Commission, which we called Blockchaingov. And the idea with Blockchaingov is to look at how blockchain technologies can be used and adopted by existing institutional frameworks, both public and private. So instead of looking at how blockchain technology can be used to bypass institutions, we're looking at how blockchain technology can actually be instrumentalized by existing institutions in order to improve their governance, but on the inside, but also on the outside. And so how blockchain technology can also be used as a tool for global and international coordination, addressing global challenges, and so forth. And one of the big strands that we're analyzing within this research project is the global governance issue. And we're trying to analyze ways in which global challenges and coordination between multiple actors of different nature can be improved through this technology, and what are the challenges that needs to be tackled.
And so, you know, Blockchaingov is its own separate entity in which I'll be collaborating with for this series. So I just wanted to kind of like let people know that not everyone, of course, from Blockchaingov agrees or thinks exactly the way I do for everything in regards to the crypto world or politics or what have you. But I think as part of this experiment for doing this series, I'm hoping that these differences in ideas and thoughts will be a fruitful way to have more engaging conversations and discussions about all the different topics and concepts that we're probably going to be covering throughout the series. But so for this series, the purpose of it is to kind of bring on experts who, and in my opinion, I think, and Primavera, let me know if you think differently, but people who know more than Balaji on a lot of the things that he talks about in the book. So we can have those people come on and tell us kind of correct takes on what, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of economics, in terms of culture, all the different things that he talks about in the book. What are sort of the agreed upon sort of consensus on what these things are and how they work. part of the series as well is we would like to explore kind of talking to people that maybe disagree with us a lot when it comes to the network state and its theses. Since it has attracted the attention of a lot of people in crypto world, I think it's going to be really interesting to have a conversation with them to kind of delve a little bit deeper into why these things are, why these ideas are sort of attracting a lot of different types of people in the crypto space.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I think that there is no, I don't think we have any claim that there is something that is specifically right and wrong. It's just that there are different values, and we want to actually dig into what is it in this book that somehow goes against perhaps some of our values or some of our beliefs, but also trying to explore and discuss with people that might agree in order to really identify but whether there is meat into these arguments that maybe we're not capable of seeing, but also trying to extrapolate from those discussions from both the people that agree and the people that disagree. Extrapolate maybe something that everyone has in common, because getting to read this book is a big challenge for many different reasons, and yet people are reading this book. And so what is the thing that accumulates all those people, and is there this underlying principle that somehow Balaji is tapping into with the network state, and we want to try and bring this underlying principle forward so that it becomes more clear that the network state is only one out of many possible instances of this principle, and of course then opening up and paving the way for different and alternative instances of this same underlying concept to come into the discussion.
Right, yeah. And I kind of think of it, because the series is called Overthrowing the Network State, right? It's not necessarily for me about abolishing any talks about things that are associated with the network state or similar ideas, but overthrowing it in the sense of at the same time providing an alternative to it, or providing sort of a moving beyond the conceptual framework that Balaji provides, and instead sort of broadening that framework and that type of thinking to show that there are alternatives to it, which I think we'll talk about maybe more towards the end.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's overthrowing by providing the better alternative that people will naturally converge towards, as opposed to trying to dismantle the concept as such.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I'll definitely be open about my bias that I think there are much better things out there, and that I find a lot of the things when I was reading Balaji's book, I was going through my notes the other day, and I read it, on an e-reader, and I put in notes as I went through it, and I had so many WTFs and OMGs and just a lot of things that I really, really felt strongly I disagreed about. But there was still, I finished the book, and I still think that there are certain seeds of interesting ideas in there that need to be expanded on, or that need to be shown in a different light, and not the way that Balaji kind of shows it.
And that's, I think it's interesting, a book that creates so much WTF and so much discomfort. That's quite an interesting book. This is not every book creates so much strong feelings for or against it.
Yeah, I had a lot of strong. It was it was very difficult for me to finish the book. I'm not gonna lie, but I did do it. But I think maybe to sort of start off, before we get too deep into the book, I would like to give just a quick introduction of who Balaji Srinivasan is, to sort of provide the foundation for properly understanding, I think, what goes into the book, because Balaji has been extremely consistent, I think, for a long time about what he's about, which was interesting. But for those who don't know, Balaji is US born from Indian immigrants on Long Island, according to Wikipedia. He went to Stanford University for his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD. So he's sort of had formative years in the Silicon Valley area. He is pretty well famous for being the ex-CTO of Coinbase, and as well being a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, which I think he no longer is at the moment. But before that, he founded a genomics company called Council, which sold for $375 million. And in 2013, he started a crypto company that was bought by Coinbase, which is how he originally became the CTO of the company. In 2013, he gave a talk at Y Combinator about what he titled Silicon Valley's Ultimate Exit, which was basically about building an opt-in society outside of the US run by technology, sort of citing the usual libertarian tropes of seasteading that people like Peter Thiel really like, space colonization, which people like Elon Musk really like, and he cites a lot of Mark Andreessen in the talk. But already from this is 10 years ago now, he was talking about and really hyper-focusing on the idea of exit. Throughout the talk, he also talks a lot about the book, The Sovereign Individual, which is also a lot about exit and thinking about how do we use digital technologies for making that exit. Another thing that I think is pretty interesting to know about him is that he was considered to be, he was like sort of proposed as someone to be Trump's FDA commissioner, which is really interesting because at the same time, he's a strong believer in abolishing the FDA. I think probably, his time starting the genomics company probably has something to do with that. But he is very anti-FDA. He does not want it to exist. And he is also, when it comes to politics, pretty obsessed with sort of critiquing the idea of cancel culture. He repeatedly sort of likes to use the idea of wokes or like wokeism as something that has like control over nearly every major institution in the United States. He has a lot of sort of connections to what's called kind of like the Dark Enlightenment, sort of alt-right type of philosophical figures like Curtis Yarvin, like Nick Land. He had this kind of sort of controversy at one point where one of his text messages or emails were leaked. I can't remember what exactly was it about, but he kind of basically suggested doxing a particular journalist. And he sort of said, if things get hot, it may be interesting to sic the Dark Enlightenment audience on a single vulnerable hostile reporter, to dox them and turn them inside out with hostile reporting sent to their advertisers, friends, and contacts. So there's kind of like this, there's some evidence that he sort of has in the past sort of attempted to collaborate with these types of right-wing figures. In the Network State, he has a lot of references again to The Sovereign Individual, this book, which is, loved by a lot of different libertarians and anarcho-capitalists. And he also references a lot of the work of Curtis Yarvin, who is a Dark Enlightenment figure, a thinker, an alt-right intellectual figure. He is also, funny enough, the creator of Urbit, which is kind of like this alternative peer-to-peer computational system. And Curtis Yarvin had like this, it was called the Mencius Goldbug blog, where he sort of talked about a lot of his ideas. A lot of the ideas he expressed were very racist, and also expressed a kind of sympathy with a monarchy. So he has a lot in the past proposed America becoming a type of monarchy ruled by billionaires or ruled by Silicon Valley and things like this. And so all this to say is that throughout all this time, what's very common in his influences is this hyper focus on exit and downplaying, voice. If we use this framework of voice versus exit, he's very pro exit, very kind of hand waves away the idea of voice as a solution to society's problems. He also has an obsession with the need for a frontier, and that entrepreneurial men need to go into the frontier and kind of like build their own destinies, that there needs to be a place or an outlet for these type of people to go out and take control of the world in certain aspects. A lot of people have sort of framed this milieu of people as being kind of like post-neoliberalism and not so much neoliberalism as we think of it as such, but has a lot of similar strains in terms of like the history and the ideas of neoliberalism. But there are some important differences to it as well, which I think we'll sort of dive into that as we go in through the series. So yeah, that's Balaji. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Primavera.
No, I think you did a very detailed and accurate description.
Okay, so I think maybe the way we can start with the network state is I can go through. I just wanted to read what he does in the book is he provides like a definition of the network state in one sentence, and then he does it in one paragraph. So maybe I can go through those two, and then we can start from there. But so Balaji, he defines a network state in a sentence. He says, a network state is a highly aligned online community with a capacity for collective action that crowdfunds territory around the world and eventually gains diplomatic recognition from pre-existing states. So in this definition, he's kind of like providing a network state as just an alternative to living in actual states, and kind of also as well, I think, alluding to competing with other states, since it would require diplomatic recognition from those other states to be considered under this definition. A network state, in a paragraph, he says, a network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. So in this definition, he's just going into a little bit more detail on what it would actually take to make a network state. And I think what's really noticeable, of course, is that there would need to be an integrated cryptocurrency in this entire setup as well, which is why the blockchain aspect plays such a big role in much of the ways that he sort of expands on what a network state is. But it still, of course, requires a measure of diplomatic recognition. One of the things that I noticed that I think is really interesting in these definitions for me is that he uses the words collective action, which is a word that's usually associated with kind of like the left, and usually with, collective action in terms of like labor strikes or making some sort of political change, which is pretty interesting because generally he doesn't actually like a lot of those things that it's usually associated with. So just to show a little bit that he kind of he mixes up in certain ways, in certain aspects, some ideas or seeds of ideas from the left and the right.
And maybe we can give also like the recipe for disaster, if we can call it like this. So in the book, he gives a recipe, like a step-by-step instruction about how do you create your network state. For step one is found your startup society, which I think even the name is an interesting name. So it's really like a society that is based on the startup approach, where anyone that can found a company can now potentially found a state. Step number two, organize it into a group capable of collective action. So again, this capacity to act and not just to be a community to discuss things, but really there needs to be a desire and a capacity to act on particular aspects that matter for that particular startup society. Step number three, build trust offline and a crypto economy online, which is interesting because this is not just this online community. Since step three is suggests that you have to start actually having in-person meetings in the physical world in order to build trust between the various members of this startup society, while the internal economy of this society is done virtually through cryptocurrencies. Step number four, crowdfund physical nodes, right? So once you actually manage to create trust amongst the people that have met, now you can actually collectively buy land and housing and apartment in order for this community to co-live together. Step number 5, digitally connect physical communities. So creating this network of separate distributed physical territory that can now interact and communicate and, of course, trade and exchange with each other through cryptocurrencies. Step number 6, conduct an on-chain census, because there needs to be a way to prove and demonstrate that there is a population within this type of society which has a decent number of people that have a sufficient amount of incomes through the cryptocurrency transactions, but also that has a footprint in the real world through the real estate. And finally, step number 7, gain diplomatic recognition, which might be the most contentious one, I would say, in the sense that there is this kind of beautiful naivete that if you can prove that you have a population, money, and territory, that's enough of the ingredients in order to be able to claim diplomatic recognition by other states that will renegade their sovereignty on their own territory in order to give it to you in a perfectly peaceful manner.
Yeah, what I think is it's so interesting that just like how much it's hand waved away. Just that it's sort of assumed like no, it'll happen, just one way or another. But I get the feeling that the network state kind of falls in the tradition of the sovereign individual very much, in that it seems to be trying to bridge the gap between the sovereign and the sort of idealism in the sovereign individual with reality and needing to like meet people in person sometimes. Because I get the impression that the sovereign individual was definitely was very, very sort of like digitally utopian or like techno-utopian. The network state still is techno-utopian, but it's almost like he's trying to make those like small little leaps or connections into being like actually politically viable in some way.
Which I will argue this is when the techno-utopianism turns into techno-dystopianism.
Yeah.
Because it's about like, as long as you stay into your virtual techno-utopia, go for it, but trying to actually bring the techno-utopia into the physical world in a competing manner with existing nation states, that's when the dystopia actually come into being. So I don't know if it's more politically viable or actually less politically viable.
Well, yeah. So like, so reading this book, I know that you we talked about this before, and you haven't played the game before, but there's a game called BioShock that came out like I think in 2011 or something like that, which is a very good game. I really enjoyed it. But the whole plot of the game is basically you're someone who is a survivor of a plane crash in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and you come across basically this kind of like Atlantis-looking place of like this entire city that's been built underwater. And you enter it, and basically you find out that it's been sort of created by some billionaire or like entrepreneur from the 1950s or something like that, where he had sort of been able to use his money to build out this city in which they would be free from regulation, but basically he was able to attract a bunch of people to come to the city, and it became a complete dystopia in the game. And so like you are this character trying to find a way out of this underwater city, while also like learning about the story of the entire thing. The guy who built it, his name is Andrew Ryan, and he basically helped create this thing called Atom, which is like this power-ups then that you inject into yourself as a character to give you powers like being able to shoot fireballs out of your hands and things like that. So like it was very funny. I felt like BioShock already sort of went through the the dystopia that the type of things that is talked about in the network state sort of would happen. So I think, if anybody wants to kind of figure out what the network state is in some ways, maybe you could play BioShock.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, It belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose rapture. A city where the artist would not fear censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
But so some of the other kind of like criticisms or problems that I have with the network state is, of course, that it does have a very, in my opinion, bad understanding of politics, and a bad understanding of history as well. And it sort of like ignores almost like 90% of or more of the entirety of the history of colonialism, because he is so like, all we have to do is kind of like purchase islands or purchase land, and then we'll just be able to somehow be able to create our own rule of law within, you know, the confines of some other nation state, which I find, I mean, pretty insane, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think the interesting thing like is, to which extent is this question of diplomatic recognition actually important, right? If you buy land, of course, you can set up like your small little rules about, do you want to make sure that everyone that comes to your premises should sign a contract that it's only going to eat keto-friendly stuff? You can do it. You want to make a you want to make a system in which everyone that comes here has to wear very non-colorful clothing. You can do it. So the interesting thing is that most of what you can already do from like a private contractual manner, it doesn't require diplomatic recognition. The only time in which you require diplomatic recognition is because you want to extract yourself from the existing rules and regulation of an existing state, which means that you literally want to violate some of those rules, meaning you don't want to fulfill specific, probably you don't want to pay taxes to the current state. That's probably one very important reason. Secondly, you don't want to abide by specific regulation, for instance, for like FDA approval. Maybe you don't like the fact that people cannot kill each other or things like that, you know. So basically, the only time in which diplomatic recognition is required is when you're actually stepping into a particular field that goes against public laws. And therefore, the only justification why you would want to gain diplomatic recognition is to do something that the current sovereign state doesn't like you to do. And then assuming that just because you buy the territory and put a flag, all of Sweden, the nation state will be like, oh, okay, I'm going to let you do everything you want as long as you don't leave that territory. That sounds very unlikely, especially if we consider the potential externalities that your actions within your small distributed territory might have on the external or on the neighboring territories.
Right. I think that is like definitely true in countries where there is a strong state, or there is, if I could call it this, rule of law in throughout the sort of territory that it extends to. I think what that kind of believing that, dealing with the reality, what that means, I think, is that you have to go to basically poor countries. You have to go to countries in the global south that will allow you to do those things for one reason or another. Either like they have a neoliberal government and they're just kind of like okay with people being able to just purchase land, and they're lax with their regulation and they'll let you do whatever you want. But this has this basically is another form of neocolonialism at the end of the day. I get the feeling.
Yeah, basically you're negotiating with the state for additional freedom in exchange of like paying them to leave you alone.
Essentially, yeah. It's basically like they want to buy their way out of the system as it exists, so they don't have to follow, whatever thing that they're trying to avoid. Like in Balaji's case, he talks a lot about, forming a network state that doesn't have an FDA or that doesn't follow the rules of the FDA. So what I think is interesting as well to maybe bring up is that he talks about that a network state needs to have one moral innovation. So like he takes the idea of forking. So this is like the idea of copying open source code, or this happens a lot in blockchain world, where there's a fork in the chain, which people can either choose to follow the old chain or a new chain. But he sort of takes this idea and tries to apply it within like the geopolitical sense, I guess, to where you could somehow be able to fork, for example, the United States of America, but just in your network state, there's no FDA or something like that.
Right, and this is like if we apply like the activist theory of the different ways in which you can express disagreement with the current system, where you have, on the one hand, you have the insiders, which get embed within the system. They get inside of the system as a mechanism, and they get power within the system as a way of actually changing the system from the inside, which is what we will call the usual modality of politics. Then you have the outsiders, which tries to actually rebel and deconstruct the system that they dislike by
Right.
like weakening it and like really like making it like destroying its foundation so that you can build again upon it. And then you have the beyonders. And the beyonders are those that are like, actually, I don't even want to have anything to do with that system. I'm just going to create another system on the side. And if that system actually is better for people, then I don't even need to fight the existing system, because it will collapse under its own weight as more and more people just leave it, exit from the system number one, to come into this new system that I've just created, which is really interesting because, of course, you kind of need a little bit of three, because they are kind of like playing each other game. The insider have power because of the outsider that are like doing noise, but of course the outsider only can destroy a system if there is another system that is that people can go to. So they are all kind of helping each other into this expression of disagreement. And it seems that, of course, Balaji is taking a little bit of that beyonders approach of like, let's not really try to engage into politics and fix the failing nation states. Let's also not try to destroy them. They are not worth it. Let's just create something new that ideally will attract all the people that are highly aligned with this new territory.
Yeah. Very third way-esque type of approach.
Which is interesting, but to me, it's also, when we talk about forking and exit-based governance, this is obviously very appealing, especially for like digital communities, open source softwares, and all those things, because obviously this is great that you can take something, fork it, experiment with something else, and then see whether you want to merge back or whether you just want to go along a different path, and then people choose the one that they like the most. I think there is a problem when we talk about territories, because unfortunately, we only have a limited amount of land in the world.
Right.
And if forking means buying new territories and deploying a new government into this territory, not everyone has the ability to fork, first of all. So you're already limiting the exit. It's nice to claim exit, but only the people that can afford the money to exit. If exit is based on purchasing land and acquiring diplomatic recognition, you need money and you need power in order to actually exit, meaning that who is the people that are going to exit is obviously the most wealthy and the most powerful people that wants to create their own government. But then what about the people that cannot afford exit because they cannot afford crowdfunding territory around the world and gaining diplomatic recognition? And so in some way, this becomes kind of like a plutocratic model in which all the wealthy and powerful people can have their own state, and then the others have to pick one of those multiple states.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what comes to mind for me as well. It seems to me kind of like an outgrowth of kind of his. It's almost like he just has like Silicon Valley brain. Like his brain is just so morphed into like everything that is good within a Silicon Valley context, or like a very techno utopian context, and he tries to apply that to literally everything, it seems. Because like the idea of forking is, of course, like, you know, it's a nice thing that you can do in a digital space because there is no like limitation, you know, for the most part. But it isn't something that we can do so easily when it comes to real life. So by sort of not contending with the fact that by forking land, you are essentially taking away land, you're ignoring all these different externalities, and you're trying to basically eliminate like the idea of like taking political action in a lot of ways.
And there's this interesting distinction also between like governance and politics. And I think like politics is about recognizing that there is an intrinsic conflict and different interests that need to be compromised because there is simply no possible consensus. And this obsession towards governance and coordination and actually just consensus building around highly aligned individuals is completely eliminating the politics from the pictures. And if you just disagree with me, let's not talk about it. Let's just fork and let's all
now you go make your other
own
network state with your
Exactly.
Now you fork your slightly different opinion about this one thing. We cannot like possibly come to a conclusion because we don't want to engage in politics.
And we don't have any deliberation anymore. We don't even need to engage into decision making because we just want to be with people we agree with. And to me, like one of the most perhaps gap and like some naivete I think that emerged from this is really this obsession, which again I think comes from like the internet vision, Silicon Valley vision of like the declaration of independence of the cyberspace, and like that you actually can create a space that is completely independent from the rest. And of course it is not, and we have seen very well how much the internet is inherently dependent with existing geopolitical and nation state powers. And here is kind of the same. It's like this belief that you can create something that is independent, autonomous from the rest of the world, and therefore completely ignores the first of all the externalities that exist, and therefore the interdependencies that inherently exist in every single person and entity that exists on this single planet, but also eliminating, by trying desperately to eliminate any need for political debates and political discussion inside the state, in the network state in this case, then all of a sudden you're not really solving the problem. You're not eliminating politics. You're just taking politics out of the network state and putting it outside between network states, between network state and nation states. Because as long as you are doing something that I really don't like and you're my neighbor, even though you somehow belong to a different state, you're still doing something that I really don't consider to be okay. And therefore politics will happen anyways. It's just going to be geopolitics by definition, because there can be no internal politics anymore. But the problem is just there. It has not been eliminated at all. It has maybe been exacerbated by converting it into a geopolitical issue instead of an internal political issue.
Right. Yeah. But to me, this is what makes the idea of the network state so insidiously like authoritarian. Like it's either you agree with exactly, you know, our moral innovation or whatever of our network states, and if you don't, you leave or you can't be a part of it.
Exactly.
So like there is no room for discussion, for debate. It's like he's taken the cancel culture that he hates so much, he's taken it to the extreme. Like he's like leaning into cancel culture to where everyone segregates themselves, to where you just go into your own like uncancelable bubble because you're inside with people that you solely agree with. But in practice, that means probably that like, because what he talks about what he doesn't talk about really, only kind of mentions it, is that these network states would have founders, and those founders would be rulers, and these founders would have access to like I forgot what he called it, but like the mainframe of the network state. So they would be able to control, turn off and on sort of privileges for people within their network states. So it's all kind of like very authoritarian, like very despotic. It very much reminds me of basically you just choose the feudal lord that you want to live under, really.
Yeah, choose your own dictatorship. But it's not a real dictatorship because you can potentially exit it, even though you can only exit it if you can actually afford it.
Theoretically, yeah.
Yeah. Which is really funny because it's like, while it's tapping a lot into the concept of like cryptocurrencies and like blockchain-based census and all those things, somehow like the governance structure that he proposes for those network states is like so antithetic to this distributed governance, distributed consensus that is actually like part of the huge narrative and promises of blockchain technologies, and somehow is actually taking the digital feudalism of existing large online operators and bringing it back into the network state, instead of actually leveraging those alternative visions that the blockchain space is providing us, and trying to create a network state that also has not only distributed territories but also distributed governance.
Right. So I think that's part of the reason why both of us maybe were so annoyed, or just like, the issues that we found with the book is that the way in which he proposes in using, for example, blockchains or this type of technology was to me it just felt very uncreative. Like it just felt like of all the things that we could possibly do that could be beneficial in a positive sense socially, he seems to miss all of those ones and only choose the ones that were like, yeah, not that great. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Jason and Jorge, which really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did, and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I analyzed applying an anti-capture framework made for DAOs, but towards left-wing organizing, thinking about the specific challenges that they face. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this episode to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation, like as what is described in the network state, as long as we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out.
Yeah, and I think to me it's not creative, and it's also to some extent like problematic and potentially like dangerous, in the sense that it is actually advocating for something, and for good or bad reasons, perhaps mostly bad reasons. What is advocating for actually has a lot of resonance in many milieux, which is kind of surprising to me, at least. And because it is like, as a Silicon Valley person, obviously it is promoting the Silicon Valley concept of like, large unicorns, where you have like this fantastic CEO that is taking care of everything, and like can finally emancipate the large tech company from the grasp of the nation state that are preventing them from innovating and whatnot. So this is a very specific vision of innovation that is very Silicon Valley. To me, that is very different from at least the vision of the blockchain space that I am more acquainted with, which is really not about the tech founder being the king and the dictator, but rather let's eliminate this notion of the tech founder, and let's actually create a more distributed network of inclusive participation from all the members and so forth, which is not the Silicon Valley approach at all. This is maybe like the this is a part of the Web3 space that at least advocate for that. Whether they manage to implement it perfectly is another question, but at least the narrative is a different one.
Yeah. But like you mentioned, I mean, this narrative is getting the attention of a lot of people in crypto. Like I think, you definitely see it on crypto Twitter with a lot of people having like been super excited about reading his book. Like, we definitely know a couple of people that are deep in the crypto space who are very inspired by his book, who do or are actually coordinating with other, wealthy crypto people to buy land somewhere and begin to create their network state in very naive ways. You had, even Vitalik Buterin did a review of the book, or at least the idea of the network state, in which Vitalik kind of tried to give almost like a balanced review of like, yes, some things are bad, but some things are pretty interesting, and maybe we should have non-Balajian network states, is what he calls it, so you don't have to agree with Balaji's kind of like libertarianness or whatever, but you can still find things that are good within it, but that, like, I think he's generally slightly more positive. I mean, I think he's a lot more positive than I am on the idea, for sure.
Yeah, to me, I had this interesting experience, which is I started to be a little bit, I became a little bit obsessed by overthrowing the network state, I guess. And it's interesting because I realized that a lot of people that I love and admire actually resonate with this book. But what's interesting is as soon as we start engaging in the discussion about what's resonating, none of it is about the way in which Balaji is describing the network state, right? So the resonance is there for sure, but the resonance is not the resonance with Balaji network state or even with the network state as such, as a concept that is described by Balaji. There is another thing that people are resonating with, which I think is also something I might be resonating with, and maybe that many other people are resonating. And the problem is that because we don't have a vocabulary beyond the vocabulary that Balaji has provided about the network state, we can only speak of this underlying concept by using the terminology of the network state. And then all of a sudden there is this conflation, and you think that when people say, yeah, I like the network state, they say, oh, I like the Balaji network state, but actually they are liking something else that they cannot name because of lack of a vocabulary. And I think it's very important to deconstruct the Balaji description of the network state and try to understand what is it that people actually resonate with, which layer, and is it the actual instantiation that is provided by Balaji, or is it the foundational layer that Balaji has built upon, or is it something even more deep that people actually really like and resonate with? And I think we need to deconstruct that in order to be able to have a conversation, so that you can speak of things without just calling everything the network state, but also because if we manage to understand and tap into this underlying foundational layer that many people resonate with, then we can also understand what they don't resonate with, and we can start to think about how we can build upon the same foundational layer things that are quite different from Balaji's instantiation of a network state, maybe something that are not a network state at all, and yet are still building upon and tapping into the same underlying principle.
Yeah, I think, like, generally with kind of, in my experience, at least being, a socialist, speaking to a lot of libertarians, and socialists and libertarians being kind of similar in the sense that they both kind of like believe that they want a like radically different world, or believe that the institutions that currently exist are kind of failing the world at the moment. Like, I feel that the nation state, or the network state, what it's proposing is kind of like just some type of theory of change for people. It's, of course, people, the way that it's described by Balaji is they're thinking of it as like, let's get the fuck out with all of our money and let's run away without engaging in politics or engaging in any type of revolution. But I think, it's also resonating in the sense that it's an attempt at using the internet and sort of like this global layer for coordination as a way to do some type of collective action. Although the collective action that Balaji is describing is not the type of collective action that I'm really interested in, it is at least like this, it at least like acknowledges the idea of the collective that I think a lot of people are attracted to. And, like we mentioned before, I mean, the fact that he's using these words like collective action, he also describes something called a network union, which is like a pre-network state. He uses some like different vocabulary and like different like bits of left-wing theory that he kind of like, seeds in there that make it somewhat more interesting than like maybe your standard, I don't know, libertarian seasteading thing. I think that's kind of like what is attracting me and probably you as well. It just comes with so much baggage.
Yeah, and also to me, like, I think there is this question as well. There is like, I think we as a society, there has been this kind of like loss of trust in political institution and governments and nation states as we know them, essentially because, as many people would claim, is like the nation state is but too big in order to actually properly deal with internal issues and too small in order to deal with global issues. And so we have this kind of structure, which is this kind of middle ground hybrid, which is actually failing both internally and externally. And especially today, as we see like the emergence of global and weak challenges that cannot be tackled by one single actor at a time. There is a need for this kind of international and global, transnational, in fact, coordination in order to tackle those problems. Climate being perhaps the most obvious one, but not only. I think there is also this resonance about the nation state as we know it, as this kind of like single entity on one territory that only cares about its own territory, might not be the right solution to engage into these global challenges and global coordination. So I think there is this resonance of like, can we create these more networked systems, which by the way don't need to be a state, but networked collective action, global governance, and all these questions that of course resonate a lot in the Web3 and in the internet, but also in many people that are not necessarily focused on the digital, but also the physical. But there is this very important resonance, I think, around that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, like trying to come up with something that is trying to answer for the things that the state is too small for and too big for.
Mm-hmm.
But so I guess going along that line, like we want to, of course, provide some alternatives to thinking around some of the things that are being touched on here when it comes to the network state, because it is something that is being tapped on, and Blockchaingov has been doing some pretty interesting work on that. But do you want to maybe, Primavera, talk a little bit about kind of what you're thinking about when it comes to alternatives, or like what the decisions are right now, or what the two choices I guess we have? It seems to be.
So basically, to me, and like this is the work that we started to do like since a few months now with Blockchaingov, which is kind of like, if the network state, as described by Balaji, is presenting this exit-based type of governance, where you eliminate politics because you only have a line individual, and then that comes with this ideal of autonomy, independence, etc. And essentially is creating a competitive framework. So you're creating more and more plurality of states, but they're all competing with each other for population, for power, and whatnot. And so the exit-based governance is actually in increasing competition at the state level. And all of a sudden now you have conflict between states because of very different value system, because they never engage into compromise and politics. And what we want to propose is tapping on the same underlying principle, which yet we cannot fully formalize, is a different instance, which is not exit-based governance, but which is rather commons-based governance, which basically recognize the inherent need for interdependencies and interconnection that we as the citizen of this global planet have to engage with in order to create these more societies, interdependent and global society. And I think, to me, and we've been trying to think very hard with a little task force and little group of people, like what is it that we want to promote, and what is the alternative vocabulary. And that's why, to me, it's important not to say just this is not Balaji's implementation of the network state. For me, what we're actually working on as the alternative is not a network state to begin with, because it's actually not a state, because it's not even intended to compete with existing nation states. It's not intended to reproduce the same institution of the governmental authority of a state, but rather it's focusing more on the nation part of the nation state, which is more this question of what is this shared and common culture, and this sense of collective identity, this sense of belonging, and also the collective action that comes with that. And so we're still trying to find a name for it. Currently, we have a few contenders. I think none of them are perfect. One is communations, as in for communes. The other is commons nation. And then the third one, which seems to be the most popular one, is coordination, which I think is very beautiful. It expresses very clearly what is the whole point. And the specificity, like if we want to kind of compare and contrast this notion, this coordination or communation, how it distinguishes itself from the nation state is that it also tap into the question of this voluntary community of individual, but focusing a lot more on the shared culture, principle, and values, and also the idea that they have a common, often implicit agenda for achieving a particular societal vision. Right. So in that way, it's not so different from the network state. There is also the idea that a communation operates both at the local and at the global level, and has the capacity to engage in collective action, but collective action in principle with the notion of commoning, of actually creating collective governance and shared use of resources within the communation. And then, of course, the collective identity, which ideally constitutes itself through self-determination and self-sovereignty. And then perhaps the most important distinction is that, as opposed to the network state, which exists as a separate entity alongside existing nation states and therefore are competing for territory, for population, etc., and for diplomatic recognition, a communation or a coordination actually
Haha.
exists as an additional layer on top of existing nation states. So it is transnational. It completely autonomizes itself from the boundaries of a nation state, but it actually exists as an additional layer of sovereignty, which actually tackle all those domains that are not inherently belonging to a territorial approach. So in some way, you can distinguish between the state, whether it's a nation state or a network state, which is pretty much like the landlord, and which is dealing with all the things that really cannot be disconnected from the territory. It's like public infrastructure, public safety, like all the things that the territory cannot that cannot escape from the territorial approach. But then you have a lot of other things that are not inherently based on a territorial approach, and this is the potentially also the field of the communation or the coordination, where collective and communities can choose to coordinate around this kind of collective resources and actually engage. And the interesting part is that because it's no longer competing with the nation states, it's actually cooperating with it. It's actually filling the gaps, but also it's not escaping from taxation. It's not escaping from the various laws that the state is actually imposing on a particular territory, but it's creating those additional layers in order to provide additional services, which can also be either commons service, but also public services to people that exist within a particular jurisdiction. And so in this sense, we are tapping into the same thing of like, how do we achieve better distributed coordination at the global level? How do we actually deal with the current failure of network state in terms of global coordination, but also in terms of potentially providing common goods, providing specific public services and utilities, and creating those additional systems that can fit into those interstices and fills the gap, but not in a way that is autonomizing, not in a way that is completely independent, but rather in a way that is interdependent with existing jurisdiction, existing nation states, and try to cooperate with them in order to create some betterment of society, as opposed to just exit and abandon the nation state to its own demise.
I'm glad that you guys are more focused on like specifically thinking about governance, and not purely through this lens of exit, of course. Like to me, it's just I'm not sure. I haven't read the book, but I'm not sure I really like the framework of like voice versus exit as being kind of like two different things, but actually like exit being just another form of voice. It's kind of like how I think of it, because no matter how you exit, you're still going to have some sort of relationship to, whatever previous entity or organization you're a part of anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are governance tools.
Right,
I think I wouldn't say exit is a form of voice. I would say both voice and exit are a form of governance, which of course the exit has, and still you can never exit completely. Whatever you do, you're always still in the planet. So exit is a way of saying, I don't like it and I'm creating something else, or I find something better. Whereas voice is sticking to it and trying to change it from the inside.
Right. Unless we can upload our brains into the matrix, we can't really, until then, we can't really exit from the world so well.
And even then.
But I think like when it comes to, how Balaji thinks about exits, like one of the things that I think is, for me, like the biggest major hole in the entirety of the book, is that he uses this conceptual framework with what he calls leviathans, Hobbesian leviathans. And he has the God, the state, and the network as like the three leviathans, or things which have a lot of power over the way in which people live their lives. And he uses, different combinations of these things in order to come up with the sort of like three major entities in the world right now. One was woke capital, which he defines as being basically the New York Times. You have communist capital, which he says is like the Chinese Communist Party. And then you have crypto capital, which is basically everyone else who is interested in crypto and who doesn't want to, fall within these authoritarian regimes or whatever of either wokeism or Chinese communism or something. But what's interesting about that framework that he then uses is that all three of them are different types of capital. So to me, I feel like throughout this entire book, there's a missing leviathan, which is capital. The entire concept of the network state sort of just leans into already existing alienation that people feel, and sort of like justifies itself by basically saying that we should turn everything over to some sort of some form of capital, really, mostly a technologized form of it for him. And he never really explicitly talks about capital and like the power of capital and how capital itself has shaped history or the way that people act or things like this. So I think this sort of like major hole sort of relates to, this obsession with an ultimate exit of just being able to get out of things as if you can just, as if you can fix your problems by just buying it away and simply finding everyone who agrees with you. So yeah, this is it just made me think of that, like when you were talking.
Yeah, and I think this and the idea that it is enough to exit in order to solve every problem, and not recognizing that when you exit, well, now you're creating a new entity that will create disagreement. And if you exit, it means that you disagree. And now if you're disagreeing inside or if you're disagreeing outside, you're still disagreeing. The disagreement is still there. How do you cope with it? And for me, this is like a complete lack of addressing this issue, as if like exit is the solution because I'm exiting and I'm no longer connected with anything,
Right.
which is obviously extremely naive. And so how do you deal with the geopolitics? How do you deal with the disagreement when the disagreement is happening amongst states as opposed to within states?
Yeah. There's and yeah, from Balaji, it seems like there is no answer at the moment. But yeah, so like his entire book, what I will say that he is pretty decent at is that he's very good at creating his own conceptual frameworks and then like moving on from there. Like he's somehow like able to make these like very, very paradoxical stories and concepts, combining them in ways in which he's obviously doing it as a way to kind of like shock the reader, to get them out of, trying to convince them like, hey, the way that we understand the world right now, it's totally wrong. And actually, like, as a way to be able to profess his own conceptual framework. It's just that conceptual framework is something that, yeah, still, if you put it under scrutiny, has a lot of problems.
And I think the dangerous thing, and I think this is why this podcast on overthrowing the network state is very important, is because even though, of course, there is so many flaws in that particular framework, the mimetic power, even just of the name,
Yeah.
the network state, is so powerful that many people are just willing to abide to it just because they love the name and they love the mimetic power of it. And that's where I think it's important to overthrow that, so that we need to either identify all the flaws into that particular framework so that the network state is no longer that salient, or we need to create an alternative meme. It's like this kind of this meme war between like those different concepts that trying to instantiate something that people resonate with, and with different focus. And I think it's okay, like, it's okay to have the notion of the network state, and I'm sure some people do resonate with that particular thing. But the problem is that many people resonate with something else, but because there is only one meme, then they just resonate with the meme.
Right.
And I think we need a plurality of memes, a diversity of frameworks, that people can choose your meme and abide to the one that you actually believe in.
Yeah, that's we are engaging in mimetic warfare. We are declaring mimetic warfare.
Mimetic land grabbing.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to just mention that as well. Like, so many concepts in this book, we can't cover all of them right now, of course. We will slowly get through them as we go through the series, as we talk to more people, as I have others from Blockchaingov also joining in with me in these conversations. I did just wanted to, at the very end, I can imagine people who really love the network states, they thinking, well, you're criticizing it, but like, what am I supposed to read now? Like, where can I find direction on similar types of concepts and ideas around the network state? And so I figured maybe we could give just like a couple of alternative book recommendations to kind of, I guess, lead people towards some reading that they could do, maybe that covers similar topics. So like the two books that I wanted to recommend, they're ones that I've recently read. The first one being The Dawn of Everything, which was the book that David Graeber and David Wengrow wrote, before David Graeber passed away. Which I think it was really interesting because it goes through like the actual history and anthropology of different types of what ultimately I think could be considered just governance mechanisms within different tribes in the Americas, within different civilizations throughout history. There's a lot of historical evidence, which, in Balaji's book, like there is essentially none. There's very, very little historical evidence for a lot of the things that he claims. The Dawn of Everything is basically entirely history and anthropology, which is why I would recommend that book instead. If you're interested in thinking about alternatives to, the way we manage resources, the way we govern within each other, the way that we relate to each other, I think having, knowing the history of these things can be really, really useful. And then another book recommendation that I would make is the book Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal by Rodrigo Nunes. I'm still finishing up right now, but I'm really, really enjoying it. Essentially, the book covers sort of left-wing organizing and thinking about or sort of pushing back on the way that the left generally frames organization as it being, something that is completely vertical through the party form, through Leninist tactics, or completely kind of anarchist, horizontalist, nobody has power organizational forms. Sometimes we think about these two extremes as being like we have to choose between one or the other as being a superior form to organize, to make political change. But in fact, he says that we should be instead embracing political complexity, or thinking about using, instead of whether or not to use something, but thinking of it as how much should we use something. That these things, some amount of verticality or horizontality always exists. It's just a matter of how much they exist, and not whether or not they exist in this kind of like binary terms. So I think those two books are two pretty interesting alternatives if you're interested in an alternative to the network state.
Yeah, and then maybe like two more books whose author both will be on this podcast. One is Survival of the Richest by Douglas Rushkoff, which pretty much describe, I think, very accurately the mindset of people that do engage into this exit-based governance. Which most of the time are those rich rich people that can afford to exit the system because they don't need to rely on any, and has this very interesting narrative of the survival of the richest is actually about the richest building systems that are destructive and then trying to escape from the system that they have created into a new system that will also eventually destroy itself, and then constantly trying to escape to the next system that they are building, which is eventually destroy itself and lead to a new need for escapism. But of course, only the most rich and powerful people have the capacity to escape the first one to the system that they actually have created. And the other one is Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota, which is a science fiction anthology of a few books, which all describe a world where the nation state has failed, and new alternative governance structure emerge, which somehow has some striking similarities with the notion of the network state, because those are also non-territorially based or distributed territorially based type of states or governance systems. But much more, interestingly enough, even though it is science fiction, much more carefully thought in the design of the governance, in the design of the geopolitics, and all the things that are missing completely within the network state book are actually addressed very carefully in these various science fiction stories. And yes, we will have Ada Palmer on the podcast. We will have Douglas also on the podcast to discuss those ideas as well.
It's it says something that a sci-fi book is able to answer more of these questions than Balaji's book. But we'll go more deeply into that throughout the series. So for the next couple of months, the goal is hopefully we'll be able to publish an episode every week until the end of the series. And for the next episode in the series, we'll first be talking to Glenn Weil, who was the founder of Radical Exchange, who is I guess he just has worked a lot with Vitalik Buterin in the past, and he has some criticisms himself about the network states and how everything is framed there. So are there any last words from you, Primavera, that you want to leave the listeners with, or Triander?
No, I think we covered plenty, and I'm really looking forward to all those next discussions.
Yeah, me too. I think it's gonna be interesting. Thanks a lot, guys, and we'll see you next time.